Good evening. My name is Diane Allen, and I am the Provost and Senior Vice President for Academic Affairs here at Salisbury University. As the Provost, it is my pleasure to welcome you to the Riall Lecture. I always look forward to these lectures because the speakers challenge my thinking and push me to consider ideas that are new and different. Tonight's speaker will be no different. In fact, I'm expecting that my thinking about children and testing and what is best for children will be re-energized. Years ago, I taught doctoral students, actually assessment class. I don't even want to say that in front of our guest. But in this doctoral class, we often used Alfie's writings to fuel our class discussions and to imagine what assessment could be if it was connected to the authentic work of children, and how that would guide our thinking about designing our support of children in their learning. Those were great discussions. They mattered. And I miss that kind of intellectual debate as an administrator. I will tell you that that doctoral work was done in Texas. And so Texas sort of led the charge for school reform and standardized testing and accountability. So sometimes we felt a little bit subversive in our discussions and we're afraid we'd be discovered. But we survived. So I hope tonight you'll join me in listening and thinking and then acting on what you learn. It is cliche to say that our children are our future. But if we really believe that, then tonight's lecture is all the more important. Thank you for your attendance and for supporting our lecture series. Now, let me introduce to you Cheryl Parks, who is Dean of the Seidel School of Education and Professional Studies.
Thank you, Dr. Allen, and good evening, everyone. As Dean of the Seidel School of Education and Professional Studies, please allow me to welcome you to the E. Pauline Riall Lecture Series. Over the 26-year history of the Riall Lecture Series, 48 different educators have spoken to audiences like this in this auditorium to over 27,000 students, faculty, and community members. Past speakers have included such notables as Cornell West, Linda Darling Hammond, Pedro Noguera, Salome Thomas L., Lee Schulman, and, as our first repeat visitor, tonight's speaker, Alfie Kohn. You can find the complete listing of previous Riall speakers included on the back of tonight's program. In all, I think you will agree, this lecture series provides the Salisbury community a unique and powerful opportunity to hear and consider new and provocative ideas affecting education and educators today. And it is Ms. Pauline Riall that we have to thank for this opportunity. Ms. Riall was the longtime principal and teacher at the Salisbury University campus school. The campus school was, for years, the school where all student teachers taught and attended classes. Thousands of Salisbury community members attended school here in Carruthers Hall, and the building that's the building that's now being deconstructed to make way for the new Patricia R. Guerra Academic Commons. You guys might have seen the construction going on. Ms. Riall was an Eastern Shore native who grew up near the bay in Tyascan. She went away to Towson for her teacher education. That was prior to the normal school being built in Salisbury. She became a teacher and then principal at the campus school and spent many of her professional years here. When she passed, her bequest was that the education department start this lecture series and also that an award in her name be, that an award in her name be presented to a student teacher at the conclusion of her or his internship experience. In fact, we have the first Riall Award winner, Lois Nicholson Harrison, with us tonight. Ms. Harrison, would you please stand and let us acknowledge the award that you won back in 1989? Are you here? Nope, you're not here? Okay, sorry. Anyway, she was here for dinner.
She had dinner.
One person, Pauline Riall, has made such a difference, reaching over 27,000 students, faculty, and community members, and by extension, all of their students as well. We are grateful to her and her gift, and now it is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Keith Connors, Chair of the Riall Lecture Committee, who will introduce tonight's speaker.
Ms. Harrison was here. She had a great dinner with us. I think she went back to watch the Connecticut women play the basketball championship tonight, so that's probably it. I think the fire marshal will be upset with people sitting in the aisles. We have plenty of seats down here in the front, so if you folks who are on the carpet there, would you work your way down and find some of this ample seating on this side, in the middle, and off to the side over here, too. Thank you. I'd like to thank everyone for supporting this Riall Lecture program once again, as you do every semester. It's just great to look out and see this place filled, every seat. And I think this is the biggest crowd I can remember seeing in all the years I've been attending these. Before I introduce the speaker tonight, I want to acknowledge some people who make this event possible. The members of the Riall Committee in the Seidel School, please stand. And that's Kim McCormick, Ron Sires, Ted Gilkey, and Brandy Terrell. Thank you for all your help. And a special thanks, too, to one person sort of behind the scenes who handled all the logistical details for this event flawlessly. And that's Melinda Munn in the Seidel School Dean's Office. Melinda, where are you? Kappa Delta Pi, the International Honor Society for Education, has once again supplied tonight's ushers and booksellers in the lobby. Our speaker will be happy to sign copies of his books following the lecture in the social room. You can pick one up outside the doors to the auditorium, and then the reception will be held in the social room immediately after the lecture. Several campus offices also played an important role in putting this event together. Facility reservations, public relations, publications, TV production, public safety, horticulture, and event services. As he always does, Matt Hill of Event Services has wired this auditorium so that if your cell phone should ring during the lecture, all of your social media messages and pictures will be forwarded to your parents. As noted, the Riall Lecture is in its 26th year at Salisbury University. Your program indicates that the lecture is just part of the legacy from Pauline Riall, as Dean Parks mentioned. Alfie Kohn is the first Riall speaker to make a return visit to this podium. His accomplishments have continued to accumulate since his address in 2001, as spelled out in your program. And I will not bore you by repeating the information that's already listed there. Let me tell you a couple things that I learned about Alfie today as we drove from him from Baltimore Washington Airport this afternoon to Salisbury. Lindsay Gordon and Grace Anstadt from KDP accompanied me to the trip so we could make sure we got the connection right at the terminal. Here's what I learned. His daughter and my daughter almost went to the same college. He's been on Oprah not once but twice. And he was able to answer questions from Lindsay Gordon for over 2 hours solid. When he spoke here 13 years ago, he had this auditorium vibrating with enthusiasm. So please, let's give Alfie Kohn a raucous Salisbury University welcome.
Well, that was raucous, thank you. Delighted to see you. How many of you are students here and prospective teachers? Can I see by a show of hands? Terrific. Delighted to hear it. And I'm going to assume that you're here by choice, because it would be just too painful to think that someone required or bribed you with grades to come to this talk, given the topic of this talk. How many of you are on the faculty or administration here at SU? Can I see hands? Okay. Was that actually a faculty member who made that sound? Okay. I thought it unlikely, but possible. How many of you are teachers or administrators not here at the university, but in the surrounding area who've come? Okay, welcome. Okay. Apparently it's required to make some animal-like noise for every category of person who's here. How many of you are not here in education, but in another field as an instructor or a student today? How many of you do not fit into any of the above categories? How many of you wandered in here by mistake? Are now too embarrassed to admit this fact? Well, for whatever reason you're here, I'm delighted to be here with you and honored to have been chosen to come back for a second visit, which I can only put down to a massive case of amnesia on the part of whoever invites folks to these lectures. I predict that within about 10 minutes, somebody is going to go, "Oh, crap, that's right." Forgot how controversial he was. Dr. Connors mentioned that I also was invited twice on a show that no longer exists on TV. I thought I would spend a minute telling you about this, because it makes a story that I think, at least, is mildly interesting. I'm talking about the Oprah Winfrey Show, and people who write books for a living basically go to bed, or used to go to bed each night, murmuring Oprah's name. She could, in theory, do a lot of good for an author. So I was in my office January in the mid-90s, and I answered my phone, Alfie Kohn, and I heard, "Hi, Mr. Kohn, I'm with the Oprah Winfrey Show." "Yes!" was my approximate reaction at that point, at least silently. And she indicated that she was possibly interested in having me appear on the show. I assumed it might be about one of the books that had gotten some play, one of them about competition, one about rewards. But to my astonishment, they had actually come across a book I had written earlier called The Brighter Side of Human Nature, a book about altruism and empathy that has, I don't mind telling you, has sold dozens of copies. And they were planning to do a show called The Kindness of Strangers, where they were going to invite people who had done remarkable things for people they'd never met, and people who had been the beneficiaries of these acts. You know, here, have a kidney, just amazing stuff. And I was to come on and talk about why people help and when they don't, and how to raise children who are caring and do remarkable things. And of course, I was delighted to accept the invitation, though to be honest, I had never seen the show. I lived in the other Cambridge, Massachusetts, where people pretend they don't even own televisions. So when I asked friends, "What's this show like?" you know, they pretended, "Well, I don't really own a television." Somebody said to me, "It's the best of the afternoon talk shows," which is sort of like saying gravel is the tastiest of all construction materials. So I didn't know what to expect. People were going, "What, you're going to be in an opera?" No, you know what I'm talking about. So I showed up there, and I did my bit, and here's how I came at it. I come at things backwards sometimes. I said, "Oprah," instant first name basis, this being both America and television. I said, "Oprah, imagine that we wanted to raise kids who were not generous like your guests here, who were actually pretty self-centered. We could talk about how we would do that based on the research and work backward. So one way we could raise children who were not particularly helpful is to put them in competitive activities whenever possible. Make sure that any recreational activities they engage in are competitive sports, and make sure that they are involved not just in singing, but in choral contests, and that we have awards assemblies in school. An awards assembly can be defined as an event usually held in an auditorium that instantly transforms most people present into losers. It took me a while to figure out that even the winners ultimately lose, because competitive events of all kinds mostly teach children that everybody else around you is a potential obstacle to your own success. Also, it tends to undermine excellence, contrary to the American myth that it motivates people to do their best. And in fact, one study, though I didn't mention this on the air, actually found that you can predict a child's selfishness based on how competitive the child's father is. You don't even have to make the kid compete. Just living with someone who needs to beat other people is enough to make the child focus on self-interest. It's like secondhand smoke. And the second way you could make kids self-centered and not likely to help, according to this is not something I thought up in the shower in the morning before the show. I mean, what I'm saying here, controversial though it may be, is supported by good data. So the second way you could make sure that kids aren't like your guests is to reward them with A's, with stickers, with school-wide programs that treat children like pets by giving them the equivalent of a doggy biscuit for doing whatever it is the adults tend to want. Programs that should be called TKLP, treating kids like pets, instead of, for example, PBIS. And if you reward children for doing things, even with verbal rewards, good job. I really liked the way you mindlessly obeyed authority today. When you reward or praise children, you make them more focused on self-interest. And 2 studies found that this is true. One done at the University of Toronto, one done at Arizona State. Children who are frequently rewarded or praised tend to be more self-centered, and the effect is most pronounced if they're rewarded or praised for being generous. Good job, I really like the way you shared your brownie with Diane. You're such a generous person, good job. She just became a little more selfish. I invite you to reflect on why that might be the case, because that's the interesting stuff, and I'm going to throw another one at you where I literally ask you to reflect on this out loud. With this, one possibility is that rewards, like punishments, are efforts to control people. They're not ways of working with children. A caring school community is a place that tries to work with kids to help think about how we want our school to be. A doing-to school is one that offers points, privileges, prizes, pizza parties, anything that apparently starts with a P, to children for doing what the authorities want. This is the really ugly thing about programs like PBIS. It's not just that the method is about manipulation, sugar-coated control, unlike punishments, which are just have no sugar attached, but still control in both cases. It's that a program like this, it's not just that the method is disrespectful to children and manipulative. Here's the doggy biscuit you get if you jump through the hoops. The goal is not about helping children to become morally sophisticated people. The objective is not to help children develop socially, to be independent thinkers or compassionate human beings. The goal is compliance. The goal is to get kids to do what they're told. So you manage to have a truly manipulative method married to a truly disturbing goal. And yet we pat ourselves on the shoulder because we didn't punish, we rewarded. We didn't use sticks, we used carrots. We controlled them a little more subtly. We didn't do anything to advance their moral, social, or intellectual development. Heck, the best way to destroy children's interest in reading is to give them a prize for reading a book. Because not only do they now associate reading with being controlled, which even very short people don't like a lot, as in, you're not the boss of me, but because the message of all rewards is, this must be something I wouldn't want to do. That's why they have to bribe me to do it. So the more you reward kids for doing anything, drawing a picture, reading a book, sharing a sandwich, the more you devalue the thing you're rewarding. We have more than 75 studies at this point showing that the more you reward people for doing something, the more they tend to lose interest in whatever they had to do to get the reward. It's a great way to kill interest. Why is it that so many people persist in treating kids like pets, or in some workplaces with merit pay and bonuses, even treating adults like pets? It's interesting to think about the implications of this. I can think of a bunch of reasons why people might persist, despite the consistent research showing that rewards, like punishments, are profoundly counterproductive. Not just ineffective, counterproductive. The research shows that attempts to get people to lose weight, or quit smoking, or go to the gym by giving people financial incentives don't just fail to work, but make people less likely to move in that direction than otherwise. But rewards and punishments have the appeal of being simple, to work with children, to help them develop an authentic commitment to generosity, to help kids, students love learning, takes skill, talent, time, care, and courage, because you may have to rethink what you ask them to do. To dangle a sticker, a gold star, a Pizza Hut pizza, an A, $1, or a good job in front of kids to make them comply takes no talent, no time, no care, and above all, no courage. Because you never have to rethink what you're giving them to do, you just have to bribe them to do it. The great teachers work with kids to figure out how authentically to engage them. But even if you're just narrowly focused, as I was back there in Chicago on the Oprah Winfrey Show, remember the Oprah Winfrey Show? I started talking about that a while ago. Even the people who are interested just in promoting generosity and caring would never reward people for doing that. Does that motivate them? Does it motivate them to be generous or to read a book? You say to me, some kids do seem to be motivated by grades or stickers or big thumbs up. And the answer to that little dilemma vanishes as soon as you know what psychologists have figured out decades ago. Motivation is not a single entity that can go up or down as if it were on a hydraulic lift. By the way, this is it for audiovisual tonight. I hope you're enjoying this. If you're looking for nuclear-powered, laser-guided, digitally enhanced PowerPoint, Wrong guy. That's why they brought me back here. I'm cheap. Just the hands, just the hands. If it were true that motivation could go up or down, and we want kids to be motivated, well then sure, we'll tell them, not only is this going to be on the test, so you better study, and that counts for a grade, we might give them additional rewards for having a lot of good grades. We'll give them a reward for collecting rewards. There are actually parents out there who pay kids for good grades or punish them for bad grades. This is taking a bad thing and multiplying and compounding the damage it does. But why? Why does it have that effect? Because there are different kinds of motivation. And the kind matters more than the amount. So psychologists talk about intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. Raise your hand if you're already familiar with those words. Know that. Okay. The amazing thing is how many teachers currently in the classroom know those words, can define the difference if they're asked, and then teach as if that difference didn't exist. So here's your refresher course in 10 seconds. Intrinsic motivation is a fancy term that means you get a kick out of what you're doing. You share your sandwich because that kid didn't bring enough food, and you think that's the right thing to do. Or you read a book because you want to see what happens in the next chapter. Extrinsic motivation means you do something to get a reward or avoid a punishment, something outside of, extrinsic to the task or the behavior. You got it? Okay? Now imagine, this is where the audio visuals get really fancy. Imagine that you have two hydraulic lifts where extrinsic motivation could go up or down, intrinsic motivation could go up or down. So here's 75 studies in one gesture. You ready? Let me know if you can't see this from the balcony. That's it. Want to see that again? As extrinsic motivation goes up, intrinsic motivation tends to come down. Tends to. There are few absolutes in human behavior, except that sentence. The more you get kids, every study to the best of my knowledge that has ever looked at the effect of grades on interest in learning has found a negative effect. From elementary school to college. That's why the best schools and classes and teachers do not give grades. Because, or if they have to turn in a grade at the end, they do everything possible to make students forget about grades for as long as possible. Because if you're thinking about what do I have to do to get an A in here, you have been lost as a learner. The probability of your being genuinely and fully engaged with figuring stuff out has been undermined. A few amazing students may persist in their interest despite the existence of grades. But it's a bet we don't want to make. That's why you find me an amazing teacher, someone who doesn't have to bribe or threaten students into figuring stuff out. I'll show you someone who regards grading as something unpleasant and tries to figure out how to make it invisible. That's true whether you're teaching first grade or graduate students. Rewards motivate some students, but it's only extrinsic motivation, which A, is not what we're looking for, I hope, and B, kills the kind of motivation we are looking for. Regardless of the outcome you're looking for, you don't offer doggy biscuits to make kids do it. At the class level, in families, in workplaces, at the school-wide level. On Oprah, I was just focused on generosity. I just said, if you want to make sure that kids aren't likely to grow up as caring, generous people, either put them in competitive situations or reward them for generosity so they become less likely to really care about somebody else. I mean, think about the questions kids are encouraged to ask. If you punish children, we don't call it punishment now, we call it consequences or holding them accountable. But what we really mean is making them suffer in order to teach them a lesson. The question kids come to ask is, what do they want me to do? And what happens to me if I don't do it? That's a very different question than asking, what kind of person do I want to be? Or even what kind of classroom do we want to create? But if you reward children, then the question they come to ask is, what do they want me to do? And what do I get for doing it? So the idea that you can reward kids into becoming better people is absurd on its face. They're less likely to think about the impact of their actions on other people, and more likely to think about, am I going to get another good job? Does this count? Will I get another few points from the teacher for showing up at the lecture tonight? Hypothetically speaking. Will I get a pizza or a t-shirt for reading a book? Now I like reading less because you've taught me to see it as a tedious prerequisite, a means to the end. The goal is the goodie. The thing I had to do to get the goodie, now I have no interest in doing. I didn't talk at length because, like this on Oprah, because I wasn't the only guest and there's only an hour. But I talked about those two features, and Oprah Winfrey, who was wandering around her studio audience with her handheld mic, did something I thought was remarkable. She said, I've never thought about it that way before. That is very interesting. And she turned to her audience. Isn't that interesting? And her audience, which would do anything she told them, nodded. Yes, this is interesting. She said, I'm going to have to think about that, which I thought was a pretty powerful thing to model when you heard something not only unfamiliar, but pretty damn controversial. Instead of just doing the instant kind of, well, that wouldn't work in the real world, or what do you do about kids who, which is ways of going, la 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 la. In other words, this is too threatening, because if I take this seriously, I have to question a lot of what I've been doing, and a lot of what's been done to me. But instead, she said, I'm going to have to think about that. So I was happy. I flew home from Chicago. I was a different person now. I was a person who had been on Oprah. I started hearing from people I hadn't heard from in years. Mom! No, I'm kidding. So I thought that was pretty great. And then, this was in January. In October, 9 months later, Oprah had my love child. I'm kidding. I beg your pardon. Sorry. I don't know why I said that. I think we can be pretty certain there's not going to be a third Riall lecture in my future. 9 months later, I'm in my office, the phone rings. Hi, I'm not sure if you remember me. I'm with the Oprah Winfrey Show. Oh, I don't remember. She said, we were very interested in what you said briefly about rewards when you were on, and we'd like to invite you to come back to do a segment on the show just about rewards. And of course, I reacted the way I'm sure you would have. I would have, hey, quit bugging me. I can't come bail you out every time your ratings take a dive. I think I said that. Or perhaps I just said, woo! She said, we're going to do it a little differently this time. We are actually going to do one of the experiments you describe in your book about rewards. And we are going to videotape it. And we are going to show the videotape on the air and then ask you to explain what happened. And I thought, oh, good Lord, this cannot end well. These are producers on television. What do they know about replicating a methodologically rigorous experiment? But she made it clear to me she was not asking my advice so much as doing the courtesy of letting me know what was in store. And so let me tell you what happened, which is the real point of this lengthy introduction on a topic only indirectly related to what I was asked to speak about tonight. Borrowing from the methodology of Ed DC at the University of Rochester in upstate New York, the Oprah Winfrey producers rented an office space and invited 20 children to come be evaluators of toys and games. And they misrepresented themselves as executives of a toy company who were looking for feedback from kids about toys. I heard that, I thought, okay, deception, sounds like social psych, so far so good. And they had them come in one at a time, had a bunch of games and toys to evaluate, and 10 of the kids were told that they would get a reward of $5 for each toy that they evaluated and gave their opinions about, which was a fair amount of money, especially to a 10-year-old, especially 15 years ago. And the other 10 kids weren't given any reward. And then when all the kids were done evaluating and playing with the games, the experimenter, which is the producer posing as the toy company executive, said, listen, I have to do something else in the other room for just about 5 minutes. You can sit here and do whatever you want, okay? I'll be right back. And closed the door and started the videotape from behind a one-way mirror. What happened? Of the 10 kids who had just been asked to evaluate the games and toys, with no mention of money, all of them went back and played with some of those games and toys on their own time. But of the 10 kids who played with the identical games and toys but were given a reward for doing so, 9 of the 10 did not touch or even appear to look at the games again. Boy, was I relieved. But I wasn't surprised, because scores of studies have shown exactly what I told you 10 minutes ago. When you reward people for doing something, they tend to lose interest with whatever they were rewarded for doing. This original article appeared in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, which doesn't have that many subscribers. 6 or 7 million people watched that Oprah episode and thought, oh my heavens, we're going to have to rethink what we're doing. But you know who didn't rethink what they were doing? The people responsible for what we call school reform today. Nifty segue. Because school reform these days, corporate-styled, test-driven, top-down, heavy-handed school reform based on accountability is based on the reward and punishment model, among other things. Not just how well you do on a test. A standardized test result becomes equivalent to talking about higher achievement or excellence and good results. But the way you get reluctant teachers and students to put aside real learning and focus on making better test takers is by saying, we, the decision makers up on Mount Olympus, may not have logic or good values or research on our side. The one thing we have that you don't, teachers and kids, is power. We will employ that to compel you to follow the standards that are handed down, now nationwide standards. One size fits all, common core state standards. Never forget the quotation marks. And to make sure you focus on doing what you're told to do, every 4th grader in science will learn about rocks and minerals or whatever. And we will enforce it with standardized tests, but that's not enough, because you all might blow off the standardized tests because you're interested in thinking or exploring. not in doing what the Gates Foundation that runs the US Department of Education, in effect, tells you to do. Not to say that Arne Duncan is not an excellent, and I mean excellent basketball player, because he is. Because I want to give him all the credit he's due. So you might say, why should we worry about the MSAs or the PARC tests or whatever's coming down the line? And we'll say, because we're going to make you do it. We're going to employ bribes and threats. We're going to threaten to close down your school or reconstitute it. We're going to threaten to withhold desperately needed funds from the schools that need the most help. We are going to threaten high school students by saying 12 years of academic accomplishments are irrelevant if you can't pass a single series of exit exams in high school. We are going to threaten teachers with public humiliation and their administrators by publishing scores on our website and get the newspapers to do some of our dirty work for us by publishing scores by schools, districts, and communities. But because we're nice people, we're not just going to threaten and punish and humiliate. We're also going to bribe. We're going to dangle goodies in front of you. If your scores go up, if you've shown progress at whatever, measured solely on, or almost solely on, standardized test results, then we'll give you all kinds of goodies. And some of the people who are being treated this way in positions of the school administration react not by saying, how dare you, we refuse to participate, but instead mindlessly capitulating and pressuring the people below them on the educational food chain to do the same. So superintendents in some districts, instead of pushing back against the state boards, pressure their principals to align the curriculum, that's an Orwellian verb if ever there was one, to the standards devised by distant authorities, pressure their principals to bring up the scores. And the principals, instead of saying, no, not going to go along, that would be educational malpractice, instead react by pressuring the teachers, by actually having pep rallies to celebrate high test scores, by boasting on their, what do you call those big signs out in front of the school near the football field, if their scores go up, releasing proud press releases, thereby making the schools worse, by taking pleasure and pride in the very activity that's killing the learning in the schools and turning schools into glorified test prep academies. And what do the teachers do who are under this pressure? Do they say, we're going to link arms and protect? The superintendents didn't protect the principals didn't protect the teachers. Do the teachers protect the kids? Are they buffers to absorb as much pressure as possible without getting fired? So that in the classroom, authentic learning can go on that will be very different. Because in the best schools, her fourth grade classroom is not learning the same stuff that her fourth grade classroom down the hall is learning. Her fourth grade classroom this year doesn't have the same curriculum at all as what she taught last year. Why? Because they're different kids. To say, I don't give a crap what interests you kids. We made up the curriculum before we met you. And you're going to be learning rocks and minerals, or ancient Egypt, or Venn diagrams, or whatever people far away from you decide. Do the teachers say, my job is to rescue learning, to do what I can? Or do the teachers say, give me my marching orders, I'm happy to be a test prep technician instead of a professional educator. I'm happy to run my classroom according to pre-digested standards and benchmarks and demands. Those of you who are not yet full teachers and are still learning are going to have to make a very critical decision, and it's not a one-time decision. It's a decision that will have to be renewed just about every day you're in a classroom. What is going to be your main consideration in thinking about how to teach? What is going to be the North Star you navigate by? Will it be teaching what someone else tells you and getting kids good at the narrow skill of taking standardized tests? Will it be demanding order and using programs like rewards and punishment-based discipline and classroom management to get compliance so that you get kids to fill out worksheets that have no relationship to the life of the mind and are only about cramming forgettable facts into short-term memory? Are you going to do worksheets and textbooks and lectures and quizzes and homework and preparation for standardized tests? Or is your classroom going to be about intellectual discovery, where much of the curriculum is created not only for these particular kids, but with these particular kids? That is an important distinction, where you literally work on what we're going to learn with the students so that you begin to see intrinsic motivation of a kind that not all of us had when we were in school, because that model was already rare at that point. Perhaps you remember a teacher who listened to the kids' preferences, who created a caring community. Maybe that teacher stood out for you. Maybe you're lucky enough now in your placements with cooperating teachers to have a mentor teacher who doesn't give homework. You do realize that no research has ever found any benefit to any kind of homework before kids are in high school, right? Even in high school, I would argue it's dubious. There's no benefit to making kids work what amounts to a second shift after they get home from a full day in school. It's all pain and no gain, according to the data. You may be lucky enough to have a teacher who already knows that and doesn't assign stuff. Or if she does, or he does assign homework, it's only very rarely, and it's never just about filling in worksheets or memorizing facts for a test. It's about stuff that really can't be done in school. Maybe you're lucky enough to have a teacher to work with and to learn from, who doesn't give kids grades, who would quit teaching before she would ever do something as destructive as put an 87 or a B- on a piece of paper, given all the research we have that shows that when you give students grades, three things tend to happen. One, I already mentioned, kids who are graded tend to be less interested in that topic, and perhaps in learning itself, compared to students randomly assigned to a different condition where they got the same thing to learn, but no grade was involved. Two, students who are given grades, or worse, led to think about the grades a lot by having them publicly posted, or God help us, put up on the internet, where parents and kids can look at grades often, or are reminded, folks, this counts for 27.3914% of your total grade. What happens when kids are led to focus on getting a good grade? They pick the easiest thing to do if they're given a choice. The shortest book on the list. The project whose topic they're already most familiar with. Why do students do this? Because they don't have enough grit and self-discipline? Because they're lazy and cut corners? No, because they're rational. Duh. As a student of mine said once when I was teaching 9th grade, duh, of course I picked the shortest book. Because Mr. Kohn, when you told us that this is for a grade, I'm going to get a better grade if I do something really easy. All grades, like other rewards, lead people to avoid taking intellectual risks, if they can possibly imagine that. You know this in university courses. We have research that shows that in the absence of grades or any other kind of reward, kids generally, not all kids all the time, but in general, kids tend to pick harder things to do spontaneously. Don't blame the kid for being lazy. If the kid's picking the easiest thing to do, it's because you said, I know you can get an A in here. I know you can bring up your grade. I have confidence in you that you'll get the goodie. Well, of course they're going to pick the easiest thing to do. You made them do it. Now what are you going to do? Give them a grade for effort? Grades already destroy their interest. You think you can rescue that with another grade? I love grades for effort. You got a high effort grade, but a low achievement grade. So thanks for trying, even though you're not very bright. Or you got a low effort grade. Now you can be a failure even at trying. The best thing about effort grades, by which I mean, of course, the worst thing about effort grades, is that, again, they mean we don't have to show any courage and think about what we ask them to do. The problem is in your head. The problem is in your head. We have to motivate you. We have to treat you like a pet. I never have to ask, did I give you something to do worth learning? Did I consult you about what we're learning and how and when and with whom? No, I don't have to ask that. I just have to talk about how we can get you to show a little more persistence. The third effect of grades, if you're following this, is that in addition to undermining interest and preference for challenge, is that grades tend to undermine the depth and complexity of students' thinking. You show me a class of students who have been led to focus on grades, and I'll show you students who think at a shallower level. They're less likely to ask, yeah, but excuse me, how do we really know that's true? Is there like evidence for that? Or, but doesn't that contradict what we were talking about a couple of weeks ago when we said, and are more likely to ask, do we have to know this? Is this going to be on the test? That's not I would never blame the students for that. The students have been carefully conditioned not to care about learning. That's why the best teachers never put grades on anything students do, even if they have to turn in a grade at the end. Every molecule of brain power thinking about grades is a molecule not thinking about biology or poetry or history. All right, so if I may thread my way back here, you may be lucky enough to have a mentor teacher who knows this, who doesn't grade, who doesn't give homework, who doesn't focus on amputated little factoids on worksheets or practicing stuff by rote, but somebody who leads kids in an adventure in learning. A truly remarkable role model for you watching. The kind of teacher who would never offer bribes and threats to make kids obey, but instead has every day a democratic class meeting where kids can learn democratic dispositions and social skills as they solve problems and make plans and share news together. A place where she would never dream of setting kids against each other in a contest, but instead develops a commitment to a caring community where kids feel a sense of belonging. If you're lucky enough to have a mentor teacher like that, take careful notes. But if you have a traditional teacher, one whose focus is more on order and obedience than on questioning, one who lets a textbook determine the curriculum, a committee-written, corporate-produced textbook, as in read chapter 7 and answer the odd-numbered questions, and worse, do it tonight after school. If you have a teacher who gives kids little bucks for obedience, if you have a teacher who is mostly thinking of learning as the delivery of instruction, open wide, here come facts, through the textbook or me lecturing or whatever. If you have a teacher who regards kids as a pain in the ass who have to be controlled because otherwise they never do what you tell them, and I swear they get worse every year, then you know what you should do? Take careful notes. Every day in a traditional teacher's classroom is an opportunity for you to learn what not to do. This is an example of what I'm not going to do when I have my own classroom. Ooh, thank you for giving me yet another diabolical behavior control scheme involving green, yellow, and red tickets, or threats of losing recess. Oh, I hadn't thought of that. That's good. That's good. Now little kids don't even have the right to have some time to run around. It's something we can snatch away from them in order to make them obedient. Ooh, what a good point. We could have a test in between the tests. We could even call it, oh, I don't know, we'll come up with something, a benchmark exam, or we could call it formative assessment if we know nothing about the field. We can figure out ways to get kids to memorize facts that we know damn well they're not going to remember a few months from now. And you're there taking notes, saying, yes, yes. Tell me more of what I will never do if I become a teacher, because I want to understand it. Now, I'm being a little facetious here because this is not the optimal person to learn from, though negative learning is interesting. Ideally, to buck the tide, and folks, I'm speaking to those of you who are not yet teachers with your own classrooms, but if you're going to have your own classroom and you're going to do right by children, you have to be a rebel. You cannot obey what most school districts and all states now are trying to compel teachers to do, and at the same time do right by the kids. It can't be done. You have to figure out a way to either be quietly subversive or noisily subversive. And you have to figure out how much you can get away with and not censor yourself more than necessary, because self-censorship has doomed more classrooms to worksheets and classroom management strategies than any censorship imposed by actual authority figures. It's tough in a climate where you may be evaluated based on how good your test scores are, even if every test makes kids less excited about and proficient at learning. You have to be a rebel. If you go to a faculty meeting and hear about data-driven instruction, and you don't say, something's fishy here, when we keep applying the word data to children, then you may need to recharge your crap detector. You are entering, folks, the field of education at a time when I think future historians will refer back to this period as one of the darkest periods in educational history. I say this not to just be a cheerful fellow. I say this because I want you to know being a teacher is hard work. Being a really good teacher who puts kids first, and I don't mean in the, the sort of rhetorical, empty way that administrators talk about kids. Well, we do best by our kids. Now get back to work and make sure you raise the test scores. I mean really do right by kids. That's even harder. And being a really good teacher now is really hard. Throughout the 90s, many states were beginning to trot out these long lists of standards every fifth grader shall, and standardized tests. Not every year in most states, but often enough to get in the way of learning. Back then, a lot of great teachers said, the hell with this. I'm going to teach fifth grade, not fourth grade, so I can avoid the test. Well, they were too smart for you. They said, we'll test them every year so the teachers have nowhere to run. Which is pretty much what has happened now. In the 90s, things were pretty bad. I know, I was around, I was writing and speaking about how bad things were. And then, in about 2000 or 2001, the floor broke through and we ended up in a basement we didn't even know we had. The Many Children Left Behind Act required kids to be taught every year with ludicrously implausible proficiency targets coming due this year, 2014, that few unmedicated observers ever believed were possible. And with lots of threats for the school that needed the most help. And Democrats worked with Republicans to pass this under the George W. Bush administration. And then you know what happened? Barack Obama was elected and took a very bad thing and made it incomparably worse. It was no coincidence that his choice of Arne Duncan, like a long line of other secretaries of education, never an educator in his career, was praised lavishly as soon as the appointment was announced by Margaret Spellings and Rod Page, the two secretaries of education under George W. Bush, who knew that the Obama administration was on board with not only continuing, but intensifying this corporate approach based on bribes and threats and tests. And that's exactly what happened with the Race to the Bottom, atop program that actually went the Bush administration one better by setting states against each other for artificially scarce funding, which they had to qualify for by adopting this corporate model dreamed up in right-wing think tanks and by groups like Achieve Incorporated, which is mostly corporate executives and politicians, which included weakening tenure protection, job protection for teachers, siphoning more money away from public schools to privately managed charter schools, and more testing and more national standards. And that's where we find ourselves now. We look around and we find that some of the best teachers are gone. The ones who couldn't stand this. The best teachers are the ones who say, I'll go sell shoes before I put up with this. And others are hanging on by their fingernails. The mediocre teachers don't mind this stuff. The mediocre teachers welcome a chance to prove their ability to follow directions by making kids spend their time following directions. The mediocre teachers are happy to accept a test score as an indicator of their proficiency as well as their students' aptitude. It's the great teachers, the ones I want my children to have, who say, this is appalling. Plus, We may, as Nell Nodding said, we may lose an entire generation to this nonsense, especially as we look at the effects on folks who had to pass a test to graduate from high school and knew they probably wouldn't and got out. So here's a study that was done in Colorado a number of years ago, which I found fascinating when I first read it. You may have missed it if your subscription to the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology has elapsed. So I thought I'd tell you. And then it's on my website, as is a lot of other stuff related to all the topics I've been talking about, classroom management and grades and homework and rewards and all that stuff. My website is just my name. If you can spell it, you're there. alfiekohn.org. And if you type .com instead, magically you get there anyway. So anyway, in this particular study, a bunch of fourth grade teachers were given a unit of curriculum to teach to their kids. And the teachers were divided into two groups, which were very cleverly called groups 1 and 2. And you all are group 1. And you're the teachers who are given this unit here. Teach this to your students. You are going to be held accountable for how effectively you teach this to your students based on their performance on a test they will take of this material when they are finished. You must raise standards in your classroom. And group 2 teachers were given the identical curriculum, but all they were told was, see if you can facilitate your students' understanding of this material. That's all. Then all the teachers were set loose to teach. And when they were done, all of the kids took a test. It was a very traditional test of a very traditional bit of curriculum. Nevertheless, the results were quite striking. The students who had been taught by group 1 teachers did significantly worse on the test. Now that's an interesting result, especially since it has been replicated by other related studies. It's the kind of result where you would kind of want to send a copy to your superintendent, school board members, Maryland's chief school officer, and governor while you're at it, because they may have let their subscriptions elapse too and missed the study. But I'm more interested not just in what the study found, but in speculating intelligently about why those results showed up. I'm not searching for a right answer here. The best, most important questions in education and about education don't have right answers. I just want you to think about this for a minute. Why might it be the case that kids who were taught by teachers who had just been told about the need to raise standards for which they would become held accountable, did more poorly, even on a traditional test, than the other kids taught by teachers who were not given the standards and accountability message? Would you do me a favor and turn to one person near you, preferably somebody you don't know very well, who could be sitting in a row in front of you or behind you, and in a second just say hi and introduce yourself real quickly, and then take a minute and a half to see if the two of you can come up with at least one solid hypothesis for why the results of this study came out the way they did. Say hello. you. Anybody have a match? The important thing is
The girls, I want to know the name of the girls. I want to know the name of the girls. I like the underdog and everything.
It'll be insufferable. They did it once before.
Yeah, they did it before, right?
Is that what? What's our team saying?
Get you back. Welcome back. First, just a mischievous observation. I asked you to do this, to talk just in pairs. Some of you were talking in groups larger than 2, I noticed, and some of you were not doing this at all, but just sitting there. And my reaction to that is, that's fine, as long as you show the same tolerance when your students choose not to do what you've asked. As long as it's consistent, I'm happy. Can anybody summarize what you and your partner came up with in a sentence or even a phrase? Why did the kids do more poorly, even on a traditional test, when they were taught by teachers who were told about accountability and higher standards? What do you think? Or what did you two think?
We said that it was probably the same thing that happens with the students in the beginning with rewards and punishments.
Uh-huh.
Teachers that have to teach something because their job may depend on it, state standards, whatever, are less likely to want to teach those things.
Aha. So you connected this study with its focus on teaching to the earlier research I mentioned about how rewards and punishments undermine intrinsic motivation, speculating that the teachers with that threat, which is what accountability movement is, a threat, we're going to hurt you if you don't perform up to expectations, became less interested in the task. And something about that lack of interest translated into, I don't want to put words in your mouth. Well, I do, but I want to check them out to see if this is what you meant. That lack of interest translated into less effective teaching, which translated into poorer results on the test. Thank you. Another speculation. Yeah. So you yourself didn't even remember what I asked because you were being graded for your participation here? Wow. Exhibit B, whoever this fellow's instructor is. Sorry?
I didn't have to, she was great. She was fantastic.
Oh, okay, okay. He said, with a note of desperation in his voice. Thank you. Somebody else, explain what's going on in that study. Yeah. The teacher in the second group used more creativity in the lessons because their teachers are better able to be creative with their teaching if there's no one with a gun pointing at them saying, raise the test scores or else. And you're also suggesting that it's possible that the teachers in group 1 actually told the kids, your test score counts. And that just made them what? Stressed, anxious, whatever. The researchers never spoke directly to the kids, just to the teachers, but stress is contagious. Anybody else, a different direction? Yeah. Yeah. The teacher who's not forced to teach a certain way, or one might argue a certain list of content, is better able to differentiate the instruction and respond to the individual needs of the learners in a way that somebody pressured may not feel. There was another study done in upstate New York, similar to this one, except that in the New York study, they didn't test the kids. The outcome variable, the dependent variable, was how the teachers actually taught. based on the instructions they'd received. And what they found is that the Group 1 teachers turned into drill sergeants, removing almost any opportunity for the students to play an active role in their own learning, which a raft of other research demonstrates is a powerful predictor to effective learning. Effective learning. This is the amazing thing about this study. If it was really an open-ended, thoughtful task involving understanding, and it was assessed by an authentic form of assessment, you can only imagine how enormous the divergence would have been in the results between the two groups. But even with the same kind of just memorize these facts and spit them back out on a traditional test, even there, the accountability movement falls on its face. And that's the kind of assessment and instruction that the accountability movement is grounded in. Even there it fails. Fascinating stuff. Now, when people talk about having higher standards, holding people accountable, it sounds good in a soundbite by a politician, looks good on a bumper sticker maybe, but there are some, I think, fatal flaws with this whole movement, and I'm going to mention a bunch of them quickly and not do justice to any, because I chose to begin by talking about some related issues that have to do with the classroom. And then I'm going to see if you want to ask me any questions or push back on any of this, even though we have a large group. So, the first fatal flaw, I think, of this whole approach, and this is my value judgment. What I'm about to say for this one cannot be proved or disproved by research. I believe this whole school reform movement, as it's currently defined, has its goals wrong. Because the goal is really not to do what's right by children. The goal has to do with creating, it seems, docile and adequately skilled future employees. Every politician who talks about education, including Presidents Obama and Bush, always talks about the need for competitiveness in the 21st century. Always frames education as an extended vocational ed. That's why every speech that Obama's given on education has talked about the STEM subjects: science, technology, engineering, and math. Never do you hear a president or a US senator talk about the need for understanding of history and literature, and I'm proud to announce a $7 billion initiative to make sure every child in the United States appreciates the beauty of a terrifically written short story. It's always STEM stuff, and it's not because of the intrinsic elegance of a mathematical equation. It's because STEM subjects, they think, translate into dollars down the line. And the point isn't to create a functioning democracy. The point isn't to help children flourish and enjoy an enriched life of the mind. The point is to make sure that US corporations triumph over their counterparts overseas. It's not just about economics, it's about defeating other companies and countries, and even children. Have you seen the constant barrage of international rankings of students based on tests? Put aside the fact that talking about an average American test score is like talking about average American air. The quality depends on where you happen to be. Rich communities in the United States do very well even on stupid standardized tests compared to most countries in the world. Low-income communities look dreadful on international comparisons, and the United States has more child poverty than any other Western industrialized country. The problem is not bad teachers. The problem is not inadequate schools. The problems are economic. But by talking about this ranking, we encourage people to think in these terms. And you know what's worse? We encourage them to think in competitive terms, as if it were a giant sports game. We're number one! As if that's the goal here, not to be number 8 or number 14. Think about the idea of rankings. If you say the US, oh my God, we're down to number 9 in high school science or whatever, and we want to be number 1, you're saying we want children who live in other countries not to learn effectively. That is intellectually and morally bankrupt, and it's built into the idea of rankings. We should want all kids all over the world to do it, but the more it's about competition, get a load of this paradox if you've grown up in this country, the more it's about competition and winning, the less it's about excellence. That's another lecture. My first concern about this is it gets the goals wrong. The second concern I have is it gets the idea of school reform wrong, because it's based on accountability. You and I could define the word accountability in such a way that we think it's reasonable based on what people are being held accountable for and to whom. But right now, accountability has just become a code word for more control over what happens in classrooms by people who are not in classrooms. And the effect it has on learning is approximately what a noose has on breathing. I mean, that study I just asked you to unpack is an example of that, about the effects of control. The third concern I have is that it gets the idea of improvement wrong. A better text or test or teacher in the current climate is one that is more rigorous. If you haven't heard that word yet in the context of education, you're going to hear it soon. My favorite story about that word is a principal I know a few years ago who was doing morning drop-off. He was greeting the kids and their parents in the school, and a parent came up to him and said, "You're going to give my kid a rigorous education in this school?" And he said, "You know, I'm not sure. Let me look up the word tonight in my dictionary, and I'll come back and give you an answer tomorrow." You can tell this story was a few years ago. Today, he would just say, "Siri, what is rigor?" The next day, he found the parent and said, "The answer to your question is, good heavens, no. My challenge to you, not right now on your phones, but eventually, is find a good unabridged dictionary and look up the word rigorous and see if you can find any definition that could conceivably be associated with a richer, more engaged approach to learning. My dictionary, the American Heritage, says, see synonyms at harsh. I don't want my kids getting a rigorous education unless I get to redefine the word. But right now, the assumption is if it's harder, it must be better. That's why there are actually idiots. Let me back up a bit. That's why there are actually well-meaning people with whom I disagree who judge high schools based on how many advanced placement courses they offer. Why? AP courses are almost always the hardest courses in the school, and therefore we just assume they must be the best. The reality is that most AP courses accelerate the worst forms of teaching. They tend to be lecture-based, they tend to be textbook-driven, and the purpose isn't to learn to think like a historian or a biologist. The purpose is to get a 4, 5, or 6 on a test devised from far away. Even really good high school teachers are bad teachers when they have to teach this kind of course. But no one even asks whether the course is any good because we're socialized to accept the notion, if it's tough, it must be of higher quality. I have been to classrooms and schools that do not strike me as particularly rigorous, but where I see some fascinating stuff going on with the kids who are deeply engaged in exploring stuff. Conversely, I have been to some classrooms and schools that have rigor up the wazoo that I wouldn't send my dog to. I invite you at least to ask about this distinction. By the way, when you think in terms of difficulty level and so on, here's a thought experiment for you. Imagine that when the new tests are brought out in Maryland, almost every high school student in the entire state passes the test. Okay, that's the thought experiment. What will the reaction be from the Baltimore Sun and from your governor and from the state school board? What will their reaction be? What's that you say? Damn, these teachers are good. They'll say the tests are too easy. The standards are too low. We have to raise the bar. Check me on this. I believe that expression, raising the bar, was originated in the world of show horses. Pretty much tells you everything you need to know about the view of children on the part of people who use an expression like that. We have to raise the bar. We have to make the tests harder. Now, let's assume you're right. This is what people say everywhere in the country. And by the way, it's not entirely a thought experiment, because in some states that's exactly what happened. It's not that everybody passed the test, but too many high school students passed the test. From New Mexico to New Jersey, and the immediate response was to ratchet up the difficulty level. What does this mean, folks? Take a moment and ponder this. It means that when these folks talk about higher standards, evidently what they mean is standards that all students will never be able to meet. Because if all students met the standards, that would be prima facie evidence that the standards were too low. And we had to raise them again until we made sure there were losers. That's the American definition of excellence, something that all people by definition cannot attain. Now, if we made sure that a random sample of kids had to fail to show we have high standards, that would be obnoxious. But you and I know that it's not random. Who's most likely to fail when we've assured high standards? I put it to you, it's 5 sadly overlapping categories of students. Those on a vocational track, those identified as having special needs, those whose first language isn't English, those who are minority students, especially African Americans and Latinos, and those from poor communities. If we participate in this accountability-oriented, raise the bar, rigor at any price cult with a focus on test scores, folks, we may live to see what could be described, and this is a strong term even for me, as an educational ethnic cleansing in America. And it will be sold to us by Democrats and Republicans, and above all, corporate officials who have an unprecedented and disproportionate amount of say in what our schooling looks like. That's all built into the notion of what does it mean to say we're improving. Here's my fourth, I don't know what I'm up to, 9th. Here's my next fatal flaw. It gets teaching and learning wrong because teaching and learning tends to be based on the idea of forgettable facts and isolated skills that everybody must cover. If that's for me, I'm busy. And this is, again, an entire presentation in its own right. I would just ask you to think about the difference between student achievement, which typically just means test scores, and students' achievements. When you add an S to both words, now you're talking about real kids doing real things. But that's not what we're talking about. And so it's about specific measurable standards. Data-driven education. Linda McNeil, a professor at Rice University in Houston, said, I love this sentence, Measurable outcomes may be the least significant results of learning. If I went into a superintendent's or principal's office and I saw that sentence printed out in 42-point Helvetica and framed on the wall, measurable outcomes may be the least significant results of learning, that for me would be a marker that this administrator knows how to run a school, has a sense of education. It's the ones who think that everything can and should be reduced to numbers. That's the one where I worry about the kids. My next fatal flaw is that it gets motivation wrong, and here I'm going to summarize an hour-and-a-half talk in 1 to 2 sentences, depending on how many semicolons I stick in. The more you get kids focused on how well they're doing in school, the less engaged they tend to be in what they're doing in school. Even when you use meaningful, defensible ways of assessing students, too much focus on any kind of assessment leads kids to think about their performance, their achievement, not about why the character in this novel we're reading left home at the end, even though he didn't seem to be unhappy. Not, is there a different way to create a math equation that leads to the right answer, or set up an experiment. The best classrooms are those where kids are not having to take their temperature. They're not being asked to be judged by rubrics, where now we've added even more criteria, 57 of them in language arts, so they're not thinking, this thing that I wrote, how does it affect the reader? They're thinking, is this a 4? Every time you make kids, especially little kids, think about how well they're doing. How am I doing? The less engaged they are as learners. And there's a big pile of evidence in educational psychology about this, which most people who teach assessment are unaware of because they think that more data is good. Data good. So that's pretty much the complexity of it. And finally, my last point on this is that we get evaluation wrong. That's the one I've been talking around. Let me just say a word about it quickly. Whenever you hear people talk about excellence or achievement, all they tend to mean is higher scores on terrible tests. I'm not saying standardized tests are not accurate measures. They're extremely accurate measures of how large the houses are near your school. Up to 80 to 90% of the variance in test scores, that is the difference in test scores, between one school and another, one town and another, one state and another, can be accounted for statistically speaking without knowing a damn thing about what happened inside the classrooms. You tell me how many of your school students are on free or reduced lunch and how much education their parents got, and I'll predict your scores with chilling accuracy. To that extent, it would not just be unhelpful to publish test scores by school or community, it would be unethical. Because you would be pretending you were judging the quality of education when you were just measuring socioeconomic status. But even if your population in a school is pretty much the same from one year to the next, if I'm a principal and I say, or a superintendent, I say, our scores went up, parents, and you're a parent at my school, there are two possible reactions you could have if you're well-informed and rational. There's a moderate reaction and a radical reaction. I don't know you well enough. I'll give you both. The moderate reaction to our scores went up is, so what? That doesn't mean the teaching or learning got better. There's loads of ways to raise scores without improving the quality, depending on whom you test when, how much time you spend with the kids who are right on the bubble, just shy of making it, ignoring those above and below, and how much time you spend teaching to the test. I'm saying a lot of things that are controversial tonight, but here's one thing that is indisputable. The more time you spend getting kids prepared for a particular test by acquainting them with the content or even the format, the less valid and valuable the test becomes. Because now you're just measuring how well they were prepared for that test. Maryland was one of the states some years ago that decided to switch. I forget which test. It may have been the terrible Novas, or it might have been the Iowa tests, I don't remember. One of those tests, they got rid of the test because they were tired of paying, McGraw-Hill millions and millions of dollars, and they got the scores wrong, and they got them late, and they chose from one of the other two multinational corporations that offer tests, so they switched to the California Achievements or whatever it was. The test scores had been going up slowly when they switched to another test that was supposed to be exactly the same. The scores did what? They went through the toilet. Oh my God, said the newspapers, we thought we were making progress, and now look what's happened. Our standards are falling, our schools are failing. Your standards, and you were never doing anything except teaching kids to do well on this particular test. You want the radical response? I guess by now, yeah, sure, you're nodding, you want it, but not everybody wants it. The moderate response to, our scores went up is, so what? That doesn't mean we're making real progress. Are you ready for the radical response to that? Your scores went up? Uh-oh. That's the radical response, and I hope you never forget it. Uh-oh. As you're a parent, you should be saying, you raised the test scores? What did you have to sacrifice for my child's education to make that happen? Do the little kids still get recess? A lot of it? Do the kids still have a vibrant program of music and the arts? Are kids still in class meetings where they learn these democratic dispositions and social skills? Are kids able to learn from current events that will never be on a test, or at least not anytime soon? Are you still doing field trips regularly so kids can learn outside the classroom and go into the community? Do you have student-directed, interdisciplinary, project-based learning? Is your learning organized around questions and problems and projects, as opposed to organized around facts and skills and separate disciplines? Do you have really exciting high school electives, and I don't just mean rigorous? Or have you sacrificed this stuff to drill kids so they'll do better on bad tests? Because if you did, then the fact that you have higher scores now makes me worried. And the more I learn about what's on the tests, the more I understand that higher scores are bad news, which is why the best administrators never brag about higher scores. The most depressing story I have ever heard on this topic was a bunch of teachers sitting around complaining about various things having to do with the state tests in their faculty lounge after school. And then the principal came in and said, the score results just came in, our school just moved up a grade. They grade the schools in this particular state like they grade kids. And do you know what the teachers did? They applauded. Do you see how sad that is? When they applauded this and treated higher scores on standardized tests as good news, they became accomplices in destroying the schools. Good scores on these tests are nothing to be proud of. Bad scores on these tests are nothing to be ashamed of. And the best teachers say, I will not spend 1 minute more than absolutely necessary getting kids to do well on these tests. I will do what I have to so I don't get fired, and so people don't run roughshod over us in the short term until our society comes to its senses. But then after that, we're going to go back to the real learning. Some teachers in Indiana sent a note home to the parents listing the miraculous, wonderful, exciting curriculum units they used to teach and don't teach anymore because of pressure to teach to the standards and raise test scores. So that parents see, oh my God, when I see higher scores or lower scores in the newspaper, now I get it. Higher scores probably means worse schooling for my children. I never knew it before. And now, you know what I'm going to do? When they say test time is coming up this year, I'm going to talk to my friends at the hairdresser, in the supermarket, at my kids' birthday parties, and we are going to organize a boycott. And this is what parents are starting to do in 2014. Go to unitedoptout.com, go to fairtest.org, and learn about parents who are learning from brave teachers that if they have doubts about whether a test score really captures the proficiency of their child, if they have concerns about how much time is being wasted on prepping for standardized tests, why the hell would you allow your kid to take the test? You're feeding the beast. Not with my kids, you don't. And that's starting to spread. And some teachers are starting to say, I can't in good conscience break the shrink wrap on this stuff. Teachers in Chicago a couple of months ago, teachers at Garfield High School, famously in Seattle last year, banding together and saying, you're going to have to fire all of us. It's not that we're afraid of being held accountable. It's that these tests are destroying the intellectual life of the school and doing most of the damage on the kids who are low income or kids of color. To point to the accountability-led movement with standards and testing and saying this is raising the academic quality of our schools, that's disturbing. But to say that this is going to be done in the name of equity, that's outrageous. Folks, you don't go into teaching for the money. You figured that part out. You go into teaching because you like kids, because you like figuring stuff out with kids, because you get off on that look in the eyes of a child who suddenly says, I get it. You go into teaching because it's a chance to facilitate a process of intellectual exploration where kids become increasingly proficient at, and never forget this part, excited by ideas. If you're true to that vision, you must actively rebel against and resist school reform as devised by the Gates Foundation, politicians, and corporate officials, which is squeezing the life out of our schools. Find a mentor who gets it, even if it's not the mentor to whom you were assigned. And when you get out and have a classroom of your own, don't be alone. Find somebody else who has this child-based vision of education. Somebody you can go out with on a Friday night and have one too many glasses of white wine while you complain and dream up subversive strategies. Boost each other's morale and provide each other with practical strategies for resistance. To do right by kids, you have to be a rebel. Thank you. I don't want to make this too much longer, and I'm also going to be sitting out where the books are, including my new book, about which I said nothing, that just came out, The Myth of the Spoiled Child, which makes a fabulous gift. But I do want to just, for 5 minutes, if you can hold still, answer a couple of succinct questions before we go out there. A question, an objection, if you can put it in a few words, I'd love to respond. Please. What I see in the future depends on what you do in the future. I don't believe history unravels according to a predictable plan. It depends on us. Same answer. I mean, if we continue to basically do what we're told and censor ourselves and clap when they announce higher test scores, then this could go on indefinitely. If we decide it's time to rebel and take our schools back and resist, then I think we could just do that. And you know, enough people refuse to take the tests or teach according to the new set of standards imposed on us, then the people up on Mount Olympus may get really nervous and say, what if we gave a test and nobody came? That's when we know we've begun to take back our schools. Anybody else? I want to make sure I don't miss folks in the balcony. Yeah. Well, I did talk a bit about it in general terms in talking about the Common Core state standards. The Common Core state standards were not devised by educators. They were devised primarily by corporate officials and politicians, and then they brought in selected educators, most of them not classroom teachers, to kind of lend an imprimatur to the standards so that the education organizations wouldn't lose out because this train has left the station, and instantly the conversation became, what will the standards be, rather than why would we confuse excellence with uniformity, high standards with common standards, and believe that it has to be the same from one place to another. The math standards are allegedly more thoughtful than just calculation, but they begin with the notion that everybody's got to do calculus by the end of high school, and the whole thing becomes a lockstep forced march from first grade up to that preordained goal, a goal I find troubling in its own right. The language arts standards, devised in large part by David Coleman, who now runs the College Board, shift away from fiction in large part to informational texts in which the reader is supposed to bracket his or her personal experience and look at the text in a vacuum, which is abhorrent to most language arts professionals. So even on the details, I think they're wrong, but anything that is one size fits all and driven by one of the two national tests, PARC and Smarter Balanced, which is the name of a margarine last time I checked, is going to be problematic on its face, even if you like some of the details of the standards. I have grave concerns about that. I wrote about it in 2010 before they were laid out. You can find it on my website, and many people have written more specific and detailed critiques since then. But we're led to, if you read the newspapers, you're led to believe the only people oddly protesting the Common Core are ultra-right-wingers who are allergic to everything that's from the federal government, which is why they were very careful to pretend it's not national standards, it's just 48 states miraculously decided to do the same thing at the same time. But the reality is it's not people who support moving toward the future in the 21st century versus a bunch of ultra-conservatives saying, we refuse Washington's standards. We want to ruin the schools with our own state standards, which is pretty much the way the debate is framed in places like Texas and South Carolina and so on. But the other group of people opposing the Common Core are not those who are necessarily liberal, but those who know the most about teaching and learning. Yes? There was no single moment for me as a student, as a parent, as a researcher, or as an educator where a light bulb went on and I had an epiphany. As you notice, I spoke about a whole bunch of topics tonight. Each of them was a process of changing and moving and rethinking and reconsidering, so I can't give you a satisfying autobiographical story, nor point to, you know, Mrs. McGillicuddy in 6th grade who made me what I am today. I'd love to tell that story, but it's just not really true. It's some combination of being an ex-kid, being a parent, being somebody who reads data, and being somebody who's been in the classroom, where one by one, and if you see me in 5 or 10 years, I may have rethought some of this stuff. I hope so, to some extent. But I also hope that the central vision that has informed my remarks tonight is still there. My central vision is Thinking deeply is better than memorizing facts for their own sake. Tests tend not to be very useful or necessary ways of assessing. Collaborative communities are not only happier but more productive than places where people have to beat each other. And kids learn to make good decisions by making decisions, not by following directions. So those views, along with a few others I could mention, have been rattling around in my head for a while. And I'm happy to say that my basic values tend to be supported and corroborated by what good studies show. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm curious as to your thoughts about programs that allow people that haven't studied education to teach. Because as, like, for example, Teach for America or things like that. Because it seems as though you have the idea that the good teachers need to band together and all go work in a shoe factory. And when that happens, somebody else is going to take their place. And it's going to be the people that aren't going to school for education.
I fear you're right, which is why I was careful not to say that I want the good teachers to leave and go work in a shoe factory. I want them to be there. I want those of you who resonate to what I'm saying tonight and have thought about this stuff before I showed up to be teachers, to be rebellious teachers. That's what worries me the most, is this whole accountability movement is squeezing out the best teachers. And not by coincidence allowing people, for example, in the Teach for America program, who are often very well-meaning young people who want to do some good and give back, to think that a few weeks of training in the summer is enough to be plopped into an inner city school. And so I always ask them, I'm going to speak to some TFA teachers in Philadelphia, in fact, in a couple of months. And I'm going to say to them, and the people asking me to speak know I'm going to say this, I fear you're being used. You're being used to make education worse, especially for the most vulnerable people. Cui bono, the Latins ask. Who benefits when tenured and experienced teachers are elbowed aside for some kids specifically who haven't studied education, mostly in prestige name colleges, drop by for a couple of years? What's that about? Whose interest does it serve? I want people who not just have studied education, but are in it for the long haul, and who've studied education in a way that is consistent with these ideals. Not just, here's how you raise the bar, here's how you raise standards, here's how you raise test scores, but here's how you awaken children's minds. We need more of those people. I want them to hang on, but I don't want them to pretend that if they're going to do right by kids, that it's going to be easy. We have to move on two tracks at once. In the short run, we have to do whatever we can to minimize the damage, and in the long run, we have to become political. We have to become political. We have to be willing to take chances and push back and change the system. And I will end this tonight by pointing out to you that the Common Core standards and the Maryland tests and the idea of having to take constant tests and rubrics and homework and all the rest of this, this is not a part of life. This is not the way the world works. This is not even necessary components of schooling. This is not like the weather. These are political decisions that can be questioned and challenged and ultimately reversed. We have the support, the logic, the reasoning, and the evidence to justify doing so. What we need now is enough people to organize and maintain the courage to do that. I hope that will be you. Thanks.